Hello, friends. This is the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. The goal of the AlphaList podcast is to empower CTOs with the info and insight they need to make the best decisions for their company. We do this by hosting top thought leaders and picking their brains for insights into technical leadership and tech trends. If you believe in the power of accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Plus, if you're an experienced CTO, you will love the discussion happening in our Slack space where over 600 CTOs are sharing insights, or visit one of our events. Just go to alphalist.com to apply. Welcome to the AlphaList podcast. I am your host, Toby. And today with me is Rachel. And Rachel is VP of Engineering at Github. And beforehand, she worked for Google and Ubisoft. So she has has a quite exciting career in terms of different stops as an individual contributor, but also as a manager. And did I forget anything, Rachel? You want to add anything? I'm not good with introductions.
I've done a bunch of different stuff. So, it'll be interesting to talk to you today. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay. So first, then we start with my traditional question: how you got there? Like, what is your nerd path? When was like your first moment where you thought, okay, computers, that's it. That's the thing I'm gonna do till I'm old. When was it? And what was
I had that moment.
Yeah,
I really did. Yeah. My nerd path, actually, I think I go back to the beginning and I feel extremely lucky, actually, that I found it. So, I'd always been a good student in school, but I went into college just no idea, not knowing at all what I wanted to do. I knew I was really good at math. I'd won several sort of regional math competitions in high school. But, I didn't understand that there was a job that came out of that. And I like to be, practical. So I went into general science in college, and it was an unsettling feeling for me because I really didn't have a vision of where I was going. And so after my first year, it really came time I had to pick. And I had no idea what I wanted to do. And back then, if you had good grades, people would say pre-med, you're going to be a doctor. That's the career path. But Toby, there's this small detail that the sight of blood makes me kind of woozy and, kind of pass out. So doctor was completely off the table for me. And weirdly enough, engineering didn't even cross my mind. I wish it had, but somehow, I just didn't think it was for me. I think subconsciously I had in my head, and I hate to admit it, that engineering is for boys. And so it just wasn't there for me. So, I liked my first chemistry class, and I got a job working for my chemistry professor. I liked him a lot. So I was like, okay, we'll try this chemistry. And honestly, Toby, it was so miserable. I mean, I'm clumsy. Labs were terrible. I'd be breaking stuff. You need to be so precise with everything you're doing. There's so much memorization. I mean, so boring. Oh gosh, it was awful. But this is my nerd path moment. I feel so lucky that the chemistry program I was in had this requirement that you had to take Intro to Computer Science. And, if I could go back and find out who designed that curriculum, honestly, I cannot thank them enough, because I went to that first computer science class. The professor's just like old guy who'd been doing this for a really long time, walked up to the whiteboard and started walking us through sorting algorithms, like merge sort, bubble sort. I was just sitting there. I was stunned, and I was, just immediately hooked. And I switched my major almost immediately after that first class. It was like math, it was problem solving, it was fun. Didn't matter that I was clumsy. My roommates would make fun of me because I was constantly calling them into my room to be like, look at what I just wrote this program and it does this. And, it was just a real life-changing moment for me. It's so wonderful. So then while still in school, I got a job at a startup, an ISP, internet service provider, and a startup. It was a lot of fun. This is in the .com boom, so quite a long time ago. We were building early websites, using Microsoft Access databases, building shopping carts. It all seemed so novel. It was, the best job I'd ever had to date. So that was fantastic. And then when I graduated, I wanted to make a bit more money. So I took a job in video games at a company called Ubisoft. And I stayed there for 6 years. And again, I just learned a ton about being a developer. I also learned some lessons that have served me later in my career about, working on teams, what it took to ship a product on time, for instance. When we first started there, we were, always missing deadlines for our games, but we got a lot better. We started doing agile development. We started, improving the quality of our games as we were working, doing test-driven development and so on. So, I really did learn a lot in those 6 years. But again, there was stuff about that job that was really hard, I would say, mostly in terms of the environment. When I look back, I think at some point we were around 500 software developers and only 3 of us were women. So, it just wasn't an ideal environment, really. And so I decided I wanted out. I wanted to do something very different. I had done well at Ubisoft. I had become a TL. In fact, I think I was the first female tech lead at the company. And I had made enough money that it gave me a certain amount of flexibility and freedom, which, was really a privilege. So I decided to go back to school. I did an MBA. And then I spent, maybe almost 2 years in consulting, working in technology strategy, which was just such a different environment. I mean, I had to wear a suit. I got to work with women for the first time, which was really great. I made friends. That was wonderful. I did a lot more writing and talking in that job, though, and it wasn't so much doing. We worked on several projects that were sort of large scale process and system reengineering, where customers were in just an absolute world of hurt by the time they called in consultants. And so with that job, I really felt like it was more about cleaning up messes versus really innovating.
And was it that you had that idea that this changes your career to go into consulting, or?
After 6 years of working in video games and, never working with another woman software engineer. And, I really felt, just ready to do something entirely different. I thought I wanted to use the other side of my brain. Doing an MBA was, kind of a lark. It was fun. I got to travel, it was great. But yeah, I did think I'm changing my career. I'm kind of, it was kind of my moment of maybe I'm kind of done with core tech. But then after, I think it was actually only 18 months in consulting, I was like, no, this is not what I want. I really miss, being in core technology. And, there were a lot of great things about consulting, but wearing a suit, even they wanted me to wear makeup at some point. I mean, come on, that's just not my vibe. So, I was lucky enough that I got the recruiting call from Google. And at the time I was still living in Canada. I'm from Canada. And, it just hadn't occurred to me really to look for jobs outside of Canada. But, I did some phone calls, and then they offered me a free trip to San Francisco Bay Area to do on-sites. Of course, I'm going to go try it out. And, one thing led to another. And the next thing you know, I was back in Canada, and a moving truck showed up at my place, and I was relocating to San Francisco. So that was a really exciting time. And then, I was at Google for almost 12 years. I worked in developer infrastructure for 8. I became a manager at Google, and then a manager of managers. And eventually I was in a director role, leading a large swath of Google's developer infrastructure group, sort of everything surrounding Google's highly scaled monorepo, our custom source control systems, cloud-based development environments, code search, code review, so on and so on. One of the favorite teams that I managed there was doing research into developer productivity, actually, which is really fascinating stuff. Lots of work on how we were able to optimize the Google developer stack. And so that's something that I've had a passion for ever since.
And so essentially you built Google's deployment back then, and the whole connected services, all the metrics connected to that and connected to developer productivity then. Is that correct? Or?
Yeah, I mean, when I started at Google, we were, the company was still on Perforce. And it was an interesting time because Perforce, there's a single very powerful server that, tens of thousands of developers were connecting to. And it was really the core of a lot of our developer infrastructure, right? So, so many APIs, so many tools, scripts, systems were built on top of the Perforce API, if you will. So the one of the earliest projects I worked on for many years and that I became a manager on was a system called Piper. I published a paper about it several years ago, but yeah, it was sort of a globally distributed, highly consistent version control system, custom to Google, built in the cloud, and became the foundation of all the developer systems at Google. It was just a fascinating project and so much fun to work on. I worked with some fantastic people who are still friends of mine today.
Does the system still exist?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I gave a great talk on it actually when I was pregnant with my second child. So if you look on YouTube for my name, you can see a very large version of me when I was 9 months pregnant on stage talking about that system. And it was, the first time we had talked about it openly to the world. And it was pretty exciting to be able to share what we had accomplished there. Just was such a massive, massive mono repo.
Was that the reason for GitHub to hire you, essentially? I mean, that you built all that, the engineering platform that you're also now building?
My experience is just highly overlapping. Let's put it that way. Yes, my experience is highly overlapping. I always paid attention to GitHub. It was always interesting to see what was happening in open source versus, what we were doing internally at Google.
Because I remember I already had Jason Warner on the podcast, who was back then or beforehand working for Heroku.
Jason Warner, he was the one who hooked me to come to GitHub for sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, 8 years of developer infrastructure. And then within Google, I decided I wanted to try something new. So I switched to Google Cloud, which was an emerging business at the time. And I was leading an area of Google Cloud around the data platform and insights. We built a really cool recommendations platform to surface recommendations to Google Cloud customers. And it was really fascinating in Google Cloud to see sort of the inception of that business, as well as the significant cultural change that Google engineers needed to go through in order to be successful in that business. And, there was some friction at the beginning of Google Cloud because you had all these very good engineers coming in who were used to this very engineering-centric culture, and engineers know best. And I'm not going to tolerate friction in my system. So if I see it, I'm just going to fix things. And, Google Cloud obviously is an enterprise-focused business, which is entirely different. So you needed to rely a lot more on PM. You couldn't really know yourself exactly how your customers were going to be using your product. So, that was fascinating. But then, sorry, I'm rambling on. You can.
No, I just want to say my wife works for Google, and I know that the sales side of both areas is also quite different, right? The Google Cloud sales side from the normal.
Yeah. And I mean, Google Cloud grew up in infrastructure where I was working in infrastructure, and, just the cultural difference was really, really big. Actually, when I left Google, I did Thomas Kurian did an exit interview with me. And I thought, if anyone can get a handle on this cultural stuff, he can. He's extremely bright, and I was really impressed in the interactions I had with him. But yeah, I was ready to do something different. I wanted a new challenge. I actually spent a ton of time talking to one of your other former guests, Jean-Michel Lemieux, when he was CTO at Shopify. And at that time, I was seriously considering moving back to Canada and joining Shopify. And he had a really good pitch for me, and I liked him a lot. So, that was interesting. But then, of course, like you mentioned, I got the call from the other one of your former guests, Jason Warner, who was CTO of GitHub at the time. And, like I said, I had always kept an eye on GitHub, given how overlapping it was with the developer infrastructure space that I had run for so long at Google. And in fact, I had actually participated in negotiations at Google where we were trying to acquire GitHub, which of course failed. So GitHub was definitely on my mind, right? And so Jason talked me into joining GitHub without, really giving me too much clarity on what my job and what my role would be. I knew I would be an engineering leader, but, I was lucky enough to be at a point in my career where I have to say I have a lot of privilege in being able to pick what I get to work on. And I was able to, pick to work on something that felt really good to me. I'm an extremely mission-driven person. And so I look at what GitHub's doing for the world, and I really couldn't say no to Jason. So he convinced me, and now it's been almost 3 years that I've been at GitHub.
Okay, cool. And you now are like leading engineering essentially, or heading.
I lead
the
most
whole...
of product engineering
Okay.
at GitHub. Yeah. So the engineering organization is, well over 1,000 people, and my team's about 500 people.
Wow. And
yeah. I mean, I started on a team focused on GitHub's data platform, and about a month after I joined, we started onboarding this fantastic company that we acquired called Semel, and that kicked off our new advanced security business. So I've been working on that. That's just been a fantastic group to manage. We've grown that area so much. Now I'm running most of product engineering for GitHub. I have to pinch myself sometimes because I mentioned I'm mission driven, and I get to work on all these world changing technologies like Copilot, Codespaces, GitHub's advanced security offering, of course. I also manage the core of GitHub's platform, where we're starting to try to bring more innovation with surprise, a focus on developer productivity, which is something I care a lot about. So we've been working on things like a new code search experience that I think is going to really be powerful for helping people with software development. We have a new projects experience for project management. We have an ever improving software supply chain offering. Just lots more to come. So really get to work on a breadth of stuff that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that's like so many exciting things coming out of your teams there. I mean, GitHub Actions, for example, has been like, for me, mind-blowing. I mean, it's similar to other CI/CD solutions, but it makes so much sense to have it like really connected and closely connected, and closer connected than you do with, I don't know, Circle CI. So I really love that. And also like product is just logic. So it really, it's all also like very good quality. So how do you succeed with that? And what is actually hard? Like what is the hard stuff at GitHub? Like what makes your day and your work very, like, sometimes bumpy?
Yeah, I mean, we've grown by 3x over the past, the engineering group over the past 3 years while I've been there has grown by 3. That's not an easy thing to do, right? I think we've done, a fantastic job, if I do say myself, of innovating over the last several years. But, so many of the products that are in our portfolio are relatively new, right? So 3 years ago when I started, like you said, Actions had just launched. Our advanced security business didn't exist. Codespaces didn't exist. Copilot didn't exist. All too many things to name didn't exist. And so, when you grow like that, we've also, significantly increased the complexity of our platform. And so we're really on this journey of engineering maturity, which I think is just necessary and hard. As our platform continues to grow and scale, there's certain inflection points where you need to change the way you work. So
as far as I remember, your platform is written in Rails, right?
Partly, right? We have a monolith.
Yeah.
And the monolith is written in Rails. Increasingly, we're using a lot more Go. There's definitely, like, one of the things I've been very focused on right now is, working with some of our senior engineers on our future architecture and what's that going to look like and what happens to our monolith. And what do we need to do to effectively build outside of the monolith? Because in many ways, building in the monolith is the easy path, but there's costs that were occurring every time we do that, right? So we're looking a lot at, I actually read this great Medium article recently from an ex-colleague from Google called Jonathan Zunger, who talks about layers of a system. And that's kind of the conversation that we've been having a lot at GitHub lately is, we've built a lot of products, and we've had, a lot of focus on sort of that user-facing layer. But we need to, in order to scale, think a lot more about the layers below that. So like, what shared services are we building? What building blocks do we have? What paved paths are we creating so that engineers aren't reinventing the wheel, so that we are building, secure, sustainable, maintainable, and scalable systems? What infrastructure are we using below that even? To make sure that we have, the database technology we need and so on. Increasingly, we're moving to Azure because, as much as we're an independent company, we're owned by Microsoft. And so there's a lot of advantage to just using Azure Cloud and Azure technologies. As an example, when I joined GitHub, the data team had some, bespoke kind of ML technologies that were being used for running and training models and so on. And it's sort of like fragile systems that took a lot of maintenance work.
I mean, every
and instead,
a few years ago, like every company built that, like every larger company built such tools, right? And now they're like basically useless because there's so many, like so much more high quality tools.
We're just using Azure ML. Let's just not reinvent that wheel. Let's focus on the novel stuff that we're doing on our teams, and as much as possible rely on infrastructure that we don't need. But we have, we definitely have a lot of opportunity as we think. Like many years ago, every GitHub engineer knew one another, and so there was kind of this cultural sense of like, well, folks are good. They'll just work on the right things. We don't really need to coordinate too much because we have, a set of people who know one another, and they'll just pick good work. And, with the complexity of our platform right now, that's just not possible, right? It's also not possible for everyone to know everyone. So we need to put more systems in place to ensure that we're being effective. Again, with, paved paths and focusing on, what our developer workflow is. Expanding expectations and sort of measurement of our operational health. A great example that we introduced recently is how we manage fan-out work, for instance. So fan-out work is, when you decide to get something done, maybe it's large-scale code-based evolution to clean up some technical debt, and it's something that not just one team can do, but lots of different teams all have to do, something that was historically difficult at GitHub. And the way it used to work, an engineer somewhere would have a great idea, and they would write, a discussion post or a team post internal to GitHub and say, hey, look, I realize this API we're using is or this technology we're using, it's not good. We should refactor and remove it. And look, here's my PR where I removed it from my project. Now, everyone, please go and do this, right? And, perhaps when there were a small number of engineers, working with influence to get stuff like that done could work, but we're not at that scale now. We're a global company with people working, all around the world. And so we recently have established a process for fan-out work where centrally we decide, we want to understand what's the scope of, a fan-out project that's being proposed. What's it going to cost? What's the benefit? Okay, let's choose wisely and pick a few of these things every quarter and track them. Our TPM organization, our project managers can track our progress. Let's really get this stuff done so that we make a, measurable difference. Whereas, in the past, we'd seen many sort of like half-done refactorings. And I think, sometimes that there's some benefit, but most of the time, you're probably better off not starting than stopping halfway through, right? So we're doing sort of more sort of effective decision-making around where we're investing in order to help scale and make our engineering organization effective.
Yeah, I can imagine that like at your org size, it then happens that like essentially it's fanned out in a certain part of the organization, and then another part still has to work with it, and the set of technologies that you want to remove, and then
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing is with a large team, we're one GitHub, right? And so, we can share knowledge and resources. And in some cases, we've done some great fan out recently. We're working on a project to clean up feature flags in the monolith. So, the monolith has existed for 15 years, and, feature flags are an excellent tool for deployment. But when they hang around for a long time, they affect code readability. I think there's, we had feature flags that had been turned on for years, feature flags that had never been turned on, and probably worse yet, some feature flags that were deployed for some specific enterprise customers and not for others. And, customers are not going to be having a good time if they're on some, bespoke flag that, we're not maybe properly aware about, right? So we did this effort. But that was a fan out project that we kind of staffed centrally. So we got a bunch of motivated people who were like, yeah, we really want to do this. We want to get this done. It's going to be better for everyone. And they sort of went through, and they had to work with teams in a lot of cases to figure out who owns this feature flag and can it be safely removed. But, it's been fantastic progress to see. Love doing stuff like that. I get a kick out of cleaning up technical debt, and it's that's really a developer productivity win as well, because, how many people were reading, the if then, scenario for those feature flags that now don't have to.
Yeah. And how much work it is to maintain that feature productive, right? Yeah. I really can imagine that this, like at your scale, is not a nice thing to have. And what about like you mentioned you become more and more like a Microsoft organization. What about like very central things?
I don't know if I mentioned that, but
well, you said that you're moving
where we
more and more
can
to
rely
Azure,
on Microsoft technology. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But becoming a Microsoft organization, maybe not. But what about things like central things like different programming languages? I mean, what about .NET? Is that something you would consider?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, actually, Code Spaces was a really fantastic collaboration across the VS Code team and GitHub. And so, we have a bunch of that stack is .NET, C#, and that's not something we're going to rewrite just for the fun of it, right? It's effective, working well. And so, yeah, we do think about, since I've been at GitHub, some of the other engineering maturity type things that I introduced is how we do design reviews and using design review as a communication tool, right? Because as the complexity of the platform grew so much, it would frequently happen that someone would announce something and then, we were working on that over here, or, that's not aligned with this vision that we had. So we have this sort of cascading levels of design review, and for the most important designs, we bring those to something that we call the principal council to figure out. But one of the things I had asked, I can explain this concept of principal council, but it's effectively our most senior individual contributors coupled with me and my peer in engineering leadership. But one of the things I had asked them to do was let's come up with design guidance so that all these design reviews that are coming up, that people have a foundation, that they don't have to be like, should I build this in the monolith in Ruby because that's what I did on my last project? Or can we give sort of like clear definitions of like, well, if this condition exists, you build it here and it's written in Go, versus if this condition exists, build it in monolith. And so we had made a couple of attempts at that and then realized, well, you can't just, just picking what programming language you use is like right at the scratching the surface of what the questions are. Really, we needed to do this broader sort of future architecture plan. And that's what we're working on now, where we're thinking of layers of the system. We're thinking about what shared services we need. Are there sort of core primitives that we're going to build? I think in the long run, our monolith likely becomes our UI layer because most everything connects into that. And increasingly, we're working on things that we have a project called app partitioning, and it's effectively componentizing our monolith so that we're getting cleaner API boundaries between the different logical systems within the monolith. Whether that ultimately leads to splitting services out of the monolith, we'll see. Where it's a journey that we're on figuring it out. But we're really investigating that sort of the full stack of where we're going, which then will lead to answers around things like programming language. But for now, it's mostly Go and Ruby.
And do you have a tool to communicate the components of your stack? Like, for example, a tech radar or something like that, where people understand, okay, maybe, I don't know, I rather not do it in Ruby because Ruby is no longer the way to do it at GitHub. Maybe I do it with .NET, or maybe I do it with Go. Is that something you use, or how do you do that?
I mean, that's what we're aiming towards, right? Like GitHub is built on GitHub. That's one of the things I love about GitHub. And when we do work on our systems, when we do work on our internal developer productivity, it's helping our own developers. It's also testing our products and making them better for users. So, we use repos for communication. We use GitHub discussions for communication. We sort of regularly report out. We have these council meetings where we take up some of the hardest topics. Really, this principal council that I run is about aligned technical decision making, and it's a tool for all of engineering to say like, hey, I want to start using, let's say, this database technology, but I'm not sure how that's going to work on GitHub Enterprise Server, which is our on-prem server deployment, or in our future cloud-based, platform as a service offering. And so, is this something that I can do? And like, what are the constraints? And, that's a tool for anyone in engineering to bring big questions that they don't feel can be decided within the realm of their own team, right? We really want teams to have agency on making the decisions that apply to them about the novel work that they're doing and so on. But when it comes to bigger infrastructure questions or investment questions or cross-team questions, we have this ability to bring these bigger questions to a group who's going to make thoughtful discussions, and then we'll communicate them back. We use, GitHub issues, GitHub projects, sort of all our communication is within the GitHub platform mostly. So occasionally we'll write a Google Doc still, because Google Docs are really good for iterative commenting and working. But then when something's locked, let's bring it into a repo.
Okay. So that is essentially like a anonymous post box where you can write your ideas to, and then you get a decision back, or how does it?
We're not at that scale yet of hopefully needing anonymous stuff. We do have, good anonymous mechanisms for giving feedback, but for big questions, it's usually something an engineer is actually working on and engaged in and wants to work with, other engineers to find a solution. So it's not usually anonymous. What we do have that's anonymous is something I introduced probably about 1.5 years ago. We do twice a year. We do it's called the DevSat survey. It's a developer productivity happiness survey, and that has been fantastic, right? Because it's really focused on the internal GitHub developer experience. And, we're really asking people about the various jobs to be done and where they find friction, and, asking them about the tools that we use and where they found friction. We even ask questions around, team practices, psychological safety on teams, decision-making on teams, on-call, the experience of on-call, how much, unplanned work versus planned work. There's a whole set of questions that we go through. And then we provide, anonymized reports to managers and to leadership. And that really helps inform our investment decisions. So that's a different type of decision making, but I think it's really powerful because, for instance, in the past year, we've moved, our standard development is now all on Codespaces, which has been great, right? So we went from local macOS development to cloud-based Codespaces development. And, we put out a survey recently, and I was able to add some questions specifically about Codespaces in it, around, any friction involved in using Codespaces within GitHub. And then, that's a wealth of information for the Codespaces team that they would get some of it, right? People would say some things, but when folks have this anonymous survey in front of them, they tend to give, more information. We can get, it's not just maybe the squeaky wheels. We can see where there's a real trend, where there's something more important because more people have responded. And then, the Codespaces team takes that. They can then respond in terms of the investments they're making in Codespaces. But in turn, one of the lovely things is then that ends up influencing the Codespaces product for our customers in the long run as well.
So you really use it all over the place, the Codespaces now? Is it like in the whole org? Mm-hmm. Wow, that's amazing.
I mean, there's some places where there's specific development that hasn't migrated to Codespaces yet. But yeah, it's, for onboarding, it's been lovely, right? As a new developer, even for me, I'm not doing a lot of coding. I'm mostly just, playing around with our systems and stuff. But if I want to jump in quickly, I don't have to worry about, setting up my local environment. I can just launch a Codespace and go. It's just, we're definitely not optimizing development for, managers such as myself. Yeah. But I can say it's a joy for me as well. And certainly for new developers, I think especially, when you come to a new company, there's a lot of stress and sort of anxiety, and a lot of people feel imposter syndrome. And the last thing you need is getting stuck in some setup issues in your local environment, whereas Codespaces just makes it so much easier.
Also for preview environments, right? That's
yeah,
also
absolutely. Good. Yeah.
It's like those moments when you, deploy something on a preview environment and it takes 20 minutes, 30 minutes. I don't know how long your deployments take. That can be very frustrating, right? How do you, by the way?
We definitely have more work to do. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have that context switch, and you go away, you go to the coffee machine or whatever you do then. Maybe you switch to a different task and then you come back and you don't remember where you were and so on. do you have any, like you mentioned that you have developer productivity metrics, do you have anything that measures that at GitHub, or like generally maybe from your past at Google? Was there a big learning you made, like how to actually fight that, and good metrics that you could recommend that people can use to
developer productivity metrics, so fraught. I've worked in that area for a long time, did a lot of work there at Google. Actually, I really like the anonymous survey for getting feedback on developer productivity, because we're working on metrics for sure at GitHub, but you always want to be really careful about what behaviors you're incentivizing, right? So, at one point we did start publishing, for instance, code review turnaround time. But, you don't want that. You don't want to see people's names associated with the really long, wait or so on. I think, you want to be really careful that my mission with developer productivity is, the rising tide lifting all boats, not looking for performance issues with individual people, right? Google had very sophisticated Google developer productivity work, which I think, is inspiring. We did some really cool stuff where, I'll give you an example, because most people were working in our cloud-based development environments back then. You could almost see every keystroke that people made if you wanted to dig in and analyze. So the team at Google, was able to spot some cases where, a compiler error message was giving someone a lot of trouble. For instance, they could see how many builds happened from when the compiler error message first appeared to when it was resolved. And then they would look and work on the wording and the language to see if they could reduce that time to make it clear, even, proposing proposed fixes and stuff like that. I think that is lovely work. I love that kind of thing where you can really go in and sort of use information and data to make people more effective. There's also work the team had done on context switching, which you mentioned, which is really fascinating. There's a group of researchers who worked on the cost of context switching, which is actually really high. And, we sort of recognized at the time that there were different types of builds that were happening, right? So you had builds that were happening as part of iterative development where people were working and they were waiting on their build, right? And then you had builds that happened that were kicked off by automation, or that were kicked off by a human, but a human who was at a natural context switch moment. So for instance, I just sent a PR out for review, that running that build, but I've walked away, I'm working on something else, or I'm going to a meeting, whatever the case might be, right? And so the team there did some cool work around optimizing which builds moved up to the top of the build queue and which ones were pushed back. And so really putting, human initiated builds where people were blocked doing iterative development, really trying to prioritize those to the top of the queue so they would complete as quickly as possible. That's certainly a lot of fun too.
But you're like, if you would recommend something to a young startup, let's say you have 10 developers and you still wanna be aware how productive your team is, then the good old poll is the best thing to do. Like really talking to your developers.
I think nothing is more valuable than talking to your developers. Yeah. That said, if I'm going to look at metrics, I'm going to look at build time. I'm going to look at deployment success. How often do you have to do rollbacks? I'm going to look at metrics around operational health. So like, how much downtime do you have? How quick are you to recover from downtime? I think, classic metrics like that. Sometimes, the Setadora metrics, if you're familiar with that, Nicole Forsgren actually worked with me at Google for a while. We acquired Dora when I was working there on this stuff. So she's a world expert on that. But there's definitely some good metrics to look at. And I tend to prefer those team level metrics versus the individual metrics.
Yeah,
you certainly never want to see like how many lines of code written or, how many PRs submitted.
Yeah. And if so, yes, you want to put it on team level and you actually want to compare it week to week or month to month, right? You don't want to see.
Yeah, because you can't compare one team to another, right? Yeah. Like one team doing greenfield development, you expect them to be moving a lot faster than the team that is maintaining the legacy system. And so you need to, with any metrics that you use, bring context and understanding in order to interpret those metrics. So if the team doing legacy development deploy times are increasing, build success is decreasing, then you have something to look at, right? It's that change over time.
Okay. And was it like at your scale, was there any moment when you thought, okay, now like productivity really increased? Like, was it, for example, code spaces, or was there any, let's say, moment when you said, now my job is that much better. So many things are changing for me and for my teams that it's really like an aha moment, or?
I could tell you, for me, my life is constant context switching. So I think my job is so different from, the job of all the engineers that I love, that I work with. And so I'll turn it around and talk about them and talk about the experience of using Copilot. I think GitHub Copilot, which GA'd recently, has been that aha moment for a lot of folks I've talked to. It has, it's not perfect, but it has been a real productivity tool. I think that's what it is more than anything. Mm-hmm. It's a productivity tool. It can't, figure out what you need to work on. It can't figure out what you need to do, right? But when you know what you need to do, it can help you avoid some of the toil, some of the boilerplate. It can help you, I've played around with it, and it's Copilot, you surprised me. Like, what's happening here? But I've heard from engineers even who, sometimes you have to switch the stack you're working on. Like you mentioned, with code spaces, we have, some .NET in the back end, and then there's also Ruby in the front end, and folks are switching back and forth. And when you're context switching, Copilot can just help you, get there and like get it right, and call the right API, et cetera, and save you time having to look into documentation and so on. So if I think about productivity aha moments, there's rarely those, right? Like, it's an accumulation over time of good practices, of learning, of investments. One thing we've done in my time at GitHub is significantly increase the amount of investment in our own developer experience teams. But Copilot is like one example, I think, where there was, I think we see, for folks who are using Copilot, it's something like 40% of the lines of code in the files that they're writing were suggested by Copilot, which is pretty incredible.
And well, code spaces, now is the time for a perfect product pitch, right? I can imagine that for like a monolith company, it's like kind of if you have to spin up, let's say, 10 different services to get to work and have to download data and then have some seed data somewhere, and you just need normally a doc that is that long, that you have to, like, steps you have to do until you have a productive setup. I can imagine that.
Yeah, no, code spaces is a big one too. And, I feel like with all these products, we're pretty early in the journey. I think code spaces, Copilot, we've targeted individuals first, and code spaces, we targeted enterprises first, but, we need to cross over there. There's just so much more that can be done in terms of looking at how we use code spaces. Code spaces is, compute that we can attach to various, workflows in our developer workflow. And so, I think there's a lot more to be done in terms of code spaces and really bringing it to the masses. When I worked at Google, we were doing development in the cloud a long time ago, but that was something that was sort of limited to these elite developers in companies that were spending tons and tons of money on developer infrastructure. And now, we really want to bring this stuff to the world, which is, very exciting. And I think, a lot of what feels great about GitHub is that we have all these building blocks. We have all these pieces of developer workflow that we can pull together in increasingly interesting ways. So while, code spaces started as, your IDE with your environments in the cloud, how can we bring code spaces to Jupyter notebooks, for instance, and, in our platform? I think there's so many moments. One of the things I love about having the 50,000 foot view of GitHub is seeing all these building blocks and how they can fit together. And, we just have so many examples of, one of the projects I'm working on recently is code search, which is really exciting. And I think, really it's a tool that can really help you find and understand what you're working on, right? And, I also, in the software supply chain group that I run, we have dependency graph. And dependency graph is this building block that now, we can use in code search to help understand personalized rankings for people. Like, what should we rank higher for them? Dependency graph is also, of course, very important for a lot of our vulnerability detection. And then as part of our code search project, we're also working on this fantastic technology from our semantic code team for code navigation. And we're starting to get into cross-repo code navigation. And then again, dependency graph layers in because it helps you sort of like get a good signal on what version of a particular software to jump to. But then beyond that, this semantic code sort of very, very sophisticated work that's happening has been really useful in the security business, because we have, Dependabot, which, goes around and will alert you when you're relying on, some code that has a vulnerability. And we can use semantic analysis actually to reduce the noise with Dependabot alerts to say, like, actually, even though you're depending on this package that has a vulnerability, your particular usage of that package never touches the code path in question. So we don't actually need to alert you on it. Copilot, you're looking at, we have Copilot, as part of your editing experience, but what about Copilot as part of the code review experience? Start to think about that. Advanced security, we've just started integrating alerting into the PR flow, which is really exciting. And like you mentioned, actions are everywhere. We recently have been experimenting more and more with prevention workflows. So for instance, looking at your dependencies at code review, at PR time, and seeing whether you're actually introducing a dependency on something that's vulnerable and then alerting about that. So, I think a lot of the fun that comes from this job is that, looking at this big picture and like piecing all the bits together.
And then slowly, step by step, building that platform that everyone wants to use, right? Every developer wants to use, and you would yourself love to use. And I can imagine that.
Absolutely. And, where can we innovate and what can we do, that's novel to delight developers and, make them happy?
What, from your perspective, we shortly have to come to the end. From your perspective, if you could give some hints of like kind of things that made your organization at scale much more a lovely place to work for. Is there anything you would recommend? Any tips you have, like things to introduce, things to change very quickly that you would recommend?
Okay, quickly, sure, yeah. Quickly is maybe not my forte, huh? Okay, so. I would think a lot about your investment portfolio. Folks are happy when they feel like they get to do quality work. There's always a balance. But I think, one of the things I found in one of our first DevSat surveys that we did was people felt like they were oversubscribed all the time. So what's your investment portfolio? Let's be sure that you're not just always scrambling to launch features, but also having healthy investment in cleaning up your technical debt. And letting engineers, like if an engineer is going to hit the same friction over and over again, that's just demoralizing. So give folks the time to go in and be able to fix those things. I think, sometimes we call it psychological safety on teams, but I also like to think of it as like, are we having fun? I have a manager on my team who says, what's the laugh factor of this team? And I kind of love that because like, how much time do you spend joking around and laughing with your colleagues? We're all human beings. And, it's good to feel those relationships. GitHub is a remote first company, so we're all working remotely, but, are we spending time on getting to know one another, laughing, having fun? I think that's, really, really important. And then, the most important thing of all, I think, certainly at my level is communication and effective decision-making. So, let's make sure that teams are not spinning. let's make sure that a decision's not taking too long. How do we do healthy escalation, get things resolved? How do we know who is the decision maker in any case? We tend to use the term DRI, which stands for directly responsible individual. So let's put in some DRIs to be able to make decisions, to be able to iterate and make sure that teams have, like a healthy cadence of being able to move forward without getting in their own way.
Good answer. Thanks a lot. And then my last question, and you already know it. Jason back then told me about a hidden feature you're building into the new GitHub projects, and you yourself, I think, had the idea. It's called the time machine feature, and you just have to write into the title of an issue. You just have to write time machine and then the year you wanna travel to, and the GitHub nickname of the person you wanna travel to. And we now do that with yourself, and we travel to the year of 2008 when you were working as an engineering manager at Google. And we can now observe yourself for a second, and then you have the chance to whisper something into your young self's ears. What would it be?
Oh, gosh. Well, first of all, that tool is going to be a developer productivity nightmare. Let me just say, how many things would I go back and try to change? No, I'm very, very fortunate and happy for what my life is today. So I wouldn't want to muck with anything. But if I did go back to early in my time at Google, I think I wasn't a manager yet until 2009. But even so, I would go back then and I would say to myself, hey, pay attention to open source. Actually, I think there's a fair amount of maybe arrogance at Google, sort of like we have the best developers in the world. And, perhaps that may have been true at one point, but just with the scale of people working in open source today, innovation is happening in open source, and open source is really where you need to be. And we built these fantastic developer tools at Google that, I'm really, thankful for that experience. But the friction for having sort of a walled garden of bespoke tools at Google really made it a lot harder to both consume and contribute to open source. And, I think back then, if someone had said, Git, really think about Git, because that's going to win. And think about your model for open source. I think that would have made, Google engineers even more productive over time. But hey, now I'm working at GitHub, which is the home for open source. So it's all good for me.
You learned.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Rachel, thanks a lot for the conversation. It was really great fun. And as you can hear in the background, I already have shouting kids here. So,
I'm just programmed to ignore shouting kids, honestly. We work remote at GitHub. There's often kids and pets in the background. And, it's just something that you learn to tune out.
Yeah, I also learned that, but at a certain level of loudness, I simply
it's distracting for you. It's more distracting for you than it is for me. I'm optimized for tuning it out, believe me.
It was a great conversation, Rachel, and I hope we have the chance again and maybe meet up in real life at a certain point. Thanks a lot.
That would be lovely.
And enjoy your day. Have a great day.
Thanks a lot, Toby.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the AlphaList podcast. If you like this episode, share it with friends. I'm sure they love it too. Make sure to subscribe so you can hear deep insights into technical leadership and technology trends as they become available. Also, please tell us if there is a topic you would like to hear more about or a technical leader whose brain you would like us to pick. AlphaList is all about helping CTOs getting access to the insights they need to make the best decisions for their company. Please send us suggestions to cto@alphalist.com. Send me a message on LinkedIn or Twitter. After all, the more knowledge we bring to CTOs, the more growth we see in tech. Or, as we say on AlphaList, accumulated knowledge to accelerate growth. See you in the next episode.